Tonight, you will walk through the life of a man who once ruled much of Europe, a man whose armies crossed mountains, deserts, and frozen plains, while millions watched his rise with admiration, fear, or quiet uncertainty. But long before the crowns, the wars, and the empire, there was only a small island in the Mediterranean Sea, and a quiet child named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was born in the year 1769 on the island of Corsica. The island had only recently become part of France, and many people there still considered themselves separate from the mainland. Corsica was rugged and mountainous. Villages rested between steep hills, and narrow roads wound through forests and rocky terrain. The air often carried the scent of salt from the sea, mixed with smoke from fireplaces burning through the evening hours. Napoleon's family was not wealthy, though they did belong to the lower ranks of local nobility. His father worked as a lawyer and political representative, while his mother, Letizia, became known for her discipline and resilience. Life inside the Bonaparte household was rarely luxurious. Meals were simple, resources were limited, and the family, like many others on the island, lived carefully and modestly. As a child, Napoleon was quiet, often serious, and deeply observant of the world around him. He spent long periods reading alone, especially stories about great commanders and ancient empires. The names of men like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar filled his imagination long before he ever commanded soldiers himself. But in Corsica, he was still only a boy walking through narrow stone streets beneath the Mediterranean sun. In the evenings, oil lamps glowed softly through village windows, while the sounds of distant waves moved against the shore. The island itself felt far away from the centers of European power, quiet, isolated, almost forgotten. Yet, beyond the sea, France was changing, and eventually that change would pull Napoleon far from the island of his childhood into a world of revolution, ambition, and war. Napoleon left Corsica at a young age. At just 9 years old, he was sent across the sea to mainland France to begin his education. For the first time in his life, the island disappeared behind him into the distance, fading slowly into the gray waters of the Mediterranean. The journey itself was quiet and uncertain. Wooden ships moved carefully across the sea, carried by cold winds and changing weather. And somewhere aboard one of those ships was a boy who spoke French with a heavy Corsican accent, entering a country that did not yet fully accept him. In the military schools of France, Napoleon often felt like an outsider. Many of the other students came from wealthier families. They spoke more confidently, dressed more elegantly, and viewed the young Corsican boy as strange and provincial. Napoleon rarely responded with emotion. Instead, he withdrew into silence. He spent long hours studying mathematics, geography, history, and military theory. Books became his refuge from isolation, while other students socialized and entertained themselves. Napoleon often read alone near dim candlelight late into the evening. The schools themselves were cold and strict. Stone hallways echoed with footsteps before sunrise. Meals were simple. Discipline was constant. Yet Napoleon adapted well to structure. He learned quickly especially in subjects related to artillery and strategy. Artillery was beginning to change warfare in Europe. Cannons required calculation, positioning, patience, and precision rather than pure physical strength. And Napoleon seemed naturally drawn toward this kind of thinking. Outside the schools, however, France itself was becoming increasingly unstable. The kingdom was struggling financially. Harvests had failed in many regions. Ordinary people faced rising food prices and growing uncertainty. In cities like Paris, tensions slowly gathered in crowded streets and marketplaces. Most people at the time could not have imagined how dramatically the world around them was about to change. But change was already approaching. By the late 1780s, frustration with the monarchy had become impossible to ignore. The old systems that had ruled France for generations were weakening. And then, in 1789, the French Revolution began. News of protests, riots, and political violence spread rapidly throughout the country. The streets of Paris became filled with fear, anger, and excitement all at once. For young officers like Napoleon, the revolution created danger, but also opportunity. The traditional aristocratic order was collapsing. Many noble officers fled France entirely, leaving empty positions within the military. Suddenly, ambitious young men who once had little influence could rise much faster than before. Napoleon watched these events carefully. He was still young, still unknown, but the unstable world around him was beginning to open doors that had once remained firmly closed. And as France entered chaos, Napoleon Bonaparte quietly moved closer toward the power. The early years of the French Revolution reshaped not only France, but the entire structure of European life. Titles that had once defined power began to lose meaning. Kings were questioned, nobles were challenged, and old hierarchies that had lasted for centuries began to collapse within a single generation. In this unstable world, Napoleon found himself returning to military service with a renewed sense of direction. He was no longer just a student of theory. He was now entering a reality where ideas were being tested through violence, uncertainty, and rapid political change. His first major opportunity came during the internal conflicts of revolutionary France. Cities were divided between those who supported the new revolutionary government and those who remained loyal to the old monarchy. These tensions often turned into armed confrontations. Napoleon, now an artillery officer, was placed in positions where precision and timing mattered more than size or numbers. In one of his early significant moments, he demonstrated a calm understanding of battlefield positioning. He did not act impulsively. Instead, he observed, calculated, and waited for the correct moment to act. This ability to remain composed while others were overwhelmed would become one of his defining traits. As the revolution intensified, foreign powers began to intervene. European monarchies viewed the collapse of the French royal system as a threat. If revolution succeeded in France, it might spread elsewhere. This fear led to a series of coalition wars against France. Armies from across Europe began to move toward French territory. It was in this environment of constant pressure and uncertainty that Napoleon's military reputation slowly began to grow. He was no longer simply a participant in the revolution. He was becoming someone who influenced its direction. During one of the critical moments in southern France, he was given command over artillery forces during a siege. The success of this operation brought him recognition from higher officials. For the first time, his name began to circulate among military leaders in Paris. Still, he remained relatively unknown to the wider public, but within military circles, his potential was being noticed. At the same time, political power in France was constantly shifting. Governments were replaced. Leaders were executed or removed. Stability was almost non-existent. Napoleon learned to navigate this environment carefully. He focused less on political alignment and more on effectiveness and results. In a world where alliances changed quickly, survival often depended on adaptability. By the mid-1790s, France was still in turmoil, but Napoleon was steadily rising within the structure of its army. He was no longer a distant observer of history. He had become part of its movement, and the events that would define his rise to power were slowly beginning to take shape. Napoleon's rise accelerated when he was assigned to command during one of the most politically sensitive periods of the Revolution. At this stage, France was no longer only fighting external wars. It was also struggling with internal instability, where control over cities and political factions could change within days. In this fragile environment, military success was not only about defeating enemies on the battlefield, but also about controlling chaos within the nation itself. Napoleon's opportunity came during a critical uprising in Paris. The city had become a center of tension. Crowds filled the streets. Armed groups moved through neighborhoods, and the government feared losing control of the capital entirely. Napoleon was placed in charge of artillery defense. His responsibility was clear: to restore order. Rather than reacting emotionally to the chaos, he approached the situation with calculation. He studied the movement of crowds, the narrow streets of Paris, and the strategic points where artillery could be most effective. When the confrontation began, the situation was tense and unpredictable. The streets were filled with noise, movement, and confusion. Smoke drifted through buildings. Commands were shouted across distances, and decisions had to be made in moments rather than hours. Napoleon's deployment of artillery was precise. He positioned cannons in a way that controlled key access points, limiting the ability of opposing forces to advance. The result was swift. The uprising was suppressed, and order was restored. This moment marked a turning point in his career. From that point onward, Napoleon was no longer viewed as a minor officer. He was seen as someone capable of decisive action under extreme pressure. Soon after, his name became more widely recognized within political and military circles. He was promoted and given greater responsibilities. With each new assignment, his influence continued to grow. France itself was still unstable, but within that instability, Napoleon was building a path forward. The revolution had created a world where traditional rules no longer guaranteed success. Instead, ability, timing, and adaptability determined who would rise. Napoleon understood this better than most, and as Europe continued to shift under the weight of war and revolution, his journey toward greater power was only just beginning. Napoleon's growing reputation soon led him beyond the borders of France. The revolutionary government, now seeking to expand its influence and secure its survival, began launching military campaigns across Europe. One of these campaigns took Napoleon to Italy. At the time, Italy was not a unified nation. It was divided into multiple states, many of which were influenced or controlled by larger European powers. Napoleon was given command of the French army in this region. For a young general, this was a major responsibility. The Italian campaign would become one of the defining phases of his early career. When he arrived, his army was poorly supplied and exhausted. Many soldiers lacked proper equipment, morale was low, and expectations from Paris were uncertain. But Napoleon did not focus on what he lacked. Instead, he focused on movement. He believed that speed could replace numbers, and surprise could replace strength. Under his command, the French army began to move rapidly across northern Italy. Battles were fought in valleys, near rivers, and across mountain passes. Napoleon's strategy was consistent: strike quickly, divide enemy forces, and prevent them from organizing a unified defense. This approach created a pattern of repeated victories. With each success, more territories came under French control. Cities changed hands, political structures were replaced, and influence spread steadily across the region. Under his command, the French army began to move rapidly across northern Italy. Battles were fought in valleys, near rivers, and across mountain passes. Napoleon's strategy was consistent: strike quickly, divide enemy forces, and prevent them from organizing a unified defense. This approach created a pattern of repeated victories. With each success, more territories came under French control. Cities changed hands, political structures were replaced, and influence spread steadily across the region. He was becoming a symbol of success for the revolution itself. Public perception began to shift. To many people in France, Napoleon represented order emerging from chaos, a figure capable of bringing structure to a world that had lost stability. Yet behind these victories, Europe was becoming increasingly aware of his rise. Other nations began to see him as a growing threat. Coalitions against France continued to form and reform. The conflict was no longer isolated. It was becoming continental. And Napoleon, still in his early career, was moving closer to the center of European history. Each victory strengthened his position, but also increased expectations. The weight of leadership was growing heavier, and the path ahead would lead him far beyond Italy, toward even larger stages of conflict and ambition. Napoleon's successes in Italy transformed him from a rising general into a figure of European attention. But success in war often brings a new kind of pressure: expectation. The French government now depended on him not only to win battles, but to secure France's position in a continent that remained hostile and unstable. After the Italian campaign, Napoleon was given command of a new expedition, Egypt. The goal was not only military, it was also strategic and symbolic. France aimed to weaken British influence by disrupting trade routes to India, while also expanding its scientific and cultural reach. When Napoleon arrived in Egypt, the environment was unlike anything he had experienced in Europe. The air was dry and heavy with heat. The landscape stretched endlessly in golden and pale tones. The silence of the desert was broken only by wind and distant movement. Ancient civilizations surrounded him in ruins and monuments that had stood for thousands of years. Pyramids rose from the sand like remnants of a forgotten world. Napoleon's army moved through this environment with difficulty. Supplies were limited, the climate was harsh, and the terrain created constant challenges for movement and communication. Despite these difficulties, Napoleon maintained strict organization within his forces. He understood that discipline would be essential in an environment where nature itself was an obstacle. In one of the most well-known moments of the campaign, French forces faced intense conflict near Cairo against local Mamluk forces. The battle was chaotic, fast, and visually overwhelming. But Napoleon's structured formation and use of infantry squares allowed his army to maintain control under pressure. The victory secured French dominance in the region for a time. However, the campaign was not solely defined by warfare. Napoleon also brought scientists, engineers, and scholars with him. Their purpose was to study the land, history, and culture of Egypt. This led to the discovery and documentation of ancient artifacts and inscriptions, including materials that would later contribute to the understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. Yet despite military victories and scientific achievements, the Egyptian campaign was not strategically stable. Supply lines were difficult to maintain. Communication with France was limited, and British naval forces controlled the surrounding seas. Over time, The situation became increasingly complicated. Napoleon found himself in a distant land, far from the political center of France, with uncertain news reaching him from Europe. Meanwhile, in France itself, political conditions were shifting once again. Power structures were unstable, governments were changing, and leadership was in transition. Napoleon's absence created a gap in influence, but also protected him from some of the immediate political consequences unfolding in Paris. Eventually, he made a decision that would once again alter his path. He left Egypt and returned to France, not as the young officer who had once crossed the Mediterranean, but as a figure whose name was already known across Europe. And when he arrived back in France, the situation he returned to was very different from the one he had left behind. When Napoleon returned to France, the country was no longer the same one he had left behind. The revolutionary era had entered a new phase. Political structures had shifted again. Governments had risen and fallen in rapid succession, and the need for stability had become more urgent than ever. France was exhausted by years of war, internal conflict, and uncertainty. In this environment, the public and political leaders began to look for strong leadership, someone capable of bringing order to a system that had been constantly changing. Napoleon returned at a moment where timing played a critical role. His military achievements in Italy and Egypt had already made his name widely known. To many, he represented competence in a time of instability. But power in France was not yet his. The government at the time was controlled by a system that struggled to maintain balance between different political factions. Trust was fragile, alliances were temporary, and authority was constantly being questioned. Napoleon, however, observed the situation carefully. He understood that direct confrontation was not always the most effective path to influence. Instead, he moved within the structure of politics, building connections and positioning himself where opportunity might emerge. The military still respected him, and parts of the public viewed him as a symbol of success abroad. But the true turning point came when internal political instability reached its peak once again. A moment arrived where the existing government structure collapsed under pressure. Power was suddenly open, and the question of who would lead France became immediate. Napoleon acted quickly. Without unnecessary hesitation, he aligned himself with key figures who supported a new form of government. Through a combination of political support, military influence, and strategic timing, he played a central role in the transition of power. This moment marked the end of the revolutionary instability and the beginning of a new political structure in France. Soon after, Napoleon assumed a leading position in the new government. From a young boy on the island of Corsica, to a student in military schools, to a general on European battlefields, he had now entered the highest level of political authority. Yet even at this stage, his rise was not complete. Power in Europe remained unstable. Neighboring nations watched France carefully, and within France itself, expectations continued to grow. Leadership would now require more than military success. It would require control, governance, and the ability to manage an entire empire. And as Napoleon stepped into this new role, the next chapter of his life began. Napoleon's rise to political power marked a new phase in both his life and in the history of France. He was no longer only a general who commanded armies in distant lands. He had become a central figure in shaping the future of a nation that was still searching for stability. In this new role, Napoleon faced a different kind of challenge. War had been familiar to him. Strategy, movement, and discipline were part of his identity, but governing a country required a broader understanding of society itself, its laws, economy, institutions, and people. France at this time was still recovering from years of revolution. The economy was unstable. Different political groups still held conflicting visions for the future, and the memory of past violence remained present in the minds of many citizens. Napoleon began implementing reforms aimed at bringing structure back into French society. Legal systems were reorganized into clearer frameworks. Administrative divisions were standardized. Education and civil institutions were given more defined roles. These changes were designed to create consistency in a country that had experienced constant disruption. At the same time, Napoleon also focused on consolidating authority. He understood that a divided leadership structure could lead to renewed instability. Gradually, power became more centralized under his direction. This shift was not sudden, but rather a slow transition shaped by political necessity and public support. Outside France, European nations observed these developments with caution. Some viewed Napoleon as a stabilizing force. Others saw him as a growing threat to the traditional balance of power. Coalitions that had once formed against revolutionary France began to reappear in new forms. The continent remained politically fragile. Meanwhile, within France, Napoleon's influence continued to expand. His leadership was now associated with both military strength and internal order. Yet with increased power came increased responsibility. Every decision carried greater consequences. Every action was scrutinized more closely. And beneath the surface of political control, Europe remained in motion. Tensions had not disappeared. They had only shifted into new forms. Napoleon's position was strong, but the environment around him was still uncertain. And as time continued forward, the balance between stability and conflict would once again be tested. Napoleon's authority continued to grow, and with it, the structure of France itself began to transform more visibly. What had once been a revolutionary state was gradually reshaped into a more centralized and controlled system under his leadership. In this period, order became the defining priority. The years of chaos, political executions, and rapid government changes had left deep marks on French society. People desired stability more than ideology. Napoleon positioned himself as the figure capable of delivering that stability. One of the most significant developments during this time was the formal establishment of a new political structure in France, where Napoleon held the highest position of power. This was not only a military leadership role anymore, it was a complete control over the state's direction, political, administrative, and military. France now operated under a unified system of governance, where decisions could be made more efficiently and implemented more directly. At the same time, Napoleon continued to strengthen the internal foundations of the country. Infrastructure, legal systems, and state institutions were further organized. The aim was to create a durable structure that could survive beyond temporary political shifts. However, as France stabilized internally, external tensions continued to rise. European powers had not fully accepted France's new position. The balance of power across the continent was still fragile, and alliances were constantly shifting. Diplomatic pressure increased. Military preparations resumed in various regions, and suspicion toward France grew once again among neighboring states. Napoleon was aware that peace in Europe was not guaranteed. The same continent that had once been reshaped by revolution was now entering a new phase of rivalry and confrontation. While France sought order within its borders, the outside world was preparing for another cycle of conflict. Napoleon's focus now expanded beyond internal governance. He was no longer only maintaining a nation, he was navigating a continent. And as Europe slowly moved toward renewed tensions, the foundations were being laid for larger confrontations that would define the next era of his rule. Napoleon's attention increasingly turned toward Europe itself. France, under his leadership, had become more stable internally than it had been for many years. But stability within one nation did not guarantee stability across the continent. Across Europe, old monarchies watched France with concern. Some feared the spread of revolutionary ideas. Others feared the growing influence of a single centralized power under Napoleon's control. Diplomatic relations became more tense. Messages between nations carried careful wording, but underlying distrust was clear. Trade routes, borders, and alliances were all influenced by shifting political calculations. In response, Napoleon strengthened France's military readiness while continuing to maintain the internal structure of the state. For him, peace was never a permanent condition. It was something that had to be maintained through balance and preparation. As time passed, the situation in Europe began to shift toward open conflict once again. Coalitions formed among rival states. Armies were reorganized. Strategic positions were reinforced. What had once been post-revolutionary uncertainty now evolved into large-scale geopolitical rivalry. Napoleon found himself once again at the center of this changing landscape. His decisions now carried consequences not only for France, but for the entire European order. Each action influenced alliances, borders, and the stability of multiple nations. Yet beneath the growing tension, there remained a consistent pattern in Napoleon's approach. He observed before he acted. He calculated before he moved. And he relied on timing as much as strength. Europe was slowly entering a new era, one defined not by revolution alone, but by continental power struggles shaped around France's position. And Napoleon, who had begun his life on a small Mediterranean island, now stood at the center of a continent, preparing for its next great conflict. The story of his rise had reached its peak of influence, but history, as always, continued forward, and the consequences of this era would echo far beyond his lifetime. But history never stays still in one place for long. While Europe was reshaping itself under the weight of empires and revolutions, far beyond its borders, another story had already been written centuries earlier. A story of endless plains, silent nights, and an empire that moved like the wind across the earth. Before Napoleon, before modern Europe, there was another name that made entire civilizations tremble. And his story begins, not in a palace, but in exile, silence, and survival. This is the life of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was not born with power. He was born into loss. His early life began in the harsh environment of the Mongolian steppe, a vast landscape of grasslands, mountains, and extreme weather. Winters were bitterly cold, and summers stretched endlessly under open skies. After the death of his father, his family was abandoned by their clan. They were left isolated in a world where survival depended entirely on loyalty, strength, and alliances. In those early years, Genghis Khan experienced hunger, fear, and constant uncertainty. He learned that in the steppe, trust was rare, and weakness was punished quickly. Yet it was in this environment that his understanding of power began to form. Not through wealth, not through inheritance, but through survival itself. The world around him was not structured like the cities of Europe. There were no fixed borders, no permanent cities in many regions, only tribes, movement, and shifting alliances. Power was fluid, and those who could unite others could reshape entire regions. As he grew older, Genghis Khan began to gather followers, not through traditional authority, but through loyalty earned in hardship. Those who stood with him were bound not by birth, but by shared experience and survival. Over time, this small group would grow, not into a kingdom at first, but into a movement. And from this movement, something far greater. would eventually emerge. An empire unlike anything the world had seen before. But at this moment, it was still only beginning. And the steppe remained vast, silent, and waiting. In the early stage of his rise, Genghis Khan, who was still known as Temujin, faced challenges that tested not only his leadership, but his ability to survive in a world where betrayal was as common as loyalty. The steppe did not offer stability. It offered constant movement, shifting alliances, and unpredictable conflicts between tribes. Temujin's strength did not come from immediate dominance. It came from his ability to unify those who had nothing to lose. As his following grew, so did opposition from rival tribes. Conflicts were not large, structured wars in the way future empires would know them. They were fast, brutal, and deeply personal struggles between groups who shared the same land but not the same trust. Temujin learned quickly that unity required more than force. It required organization. He began to structure his followers into more disciplined groups, assigning clear roles and responsibilities. Loyalty became a central principle. Those who remained loyal were rewarded with trust and position. Those who betrayed were not forgotten. Over time, this system created a foundation that was different from surrounding tribes, while others relied on fragmented leadership. Temujin's followers operated with increasing coordination. This difference began to shift the balance of power on the steppe. Gradually, smaller tribes began to either align with him or be absorbed through conflict. The name Temujin began to spread beyond his immediate circle. He was no longer just a surviving exile. He was becoming a unifying force across the grasslands. Eventually, he was given the title Genghis Khan, a title that represented authority over many, not just one group. But this title did not mark the end of his struggle. It marked the beginning of expansion. With unity achieved among his people, attention turned outward. The vast regions beyond the steppe, cities, trade routes, and established kingdoms now became visible as future targets of movement and influence. The Mongol world was no longer just surviving. It was preparing to expand. And in the silence of the open plains, an empire was slowly beginning to take shape across distance and time. With unity secured among the Mongol tribes, Genghis Khan began to shift his focus beyond internal consolidation. The steppe had once been a place of survival. Now it became a base of expansion. Unlike settled civilizations, Mongol society was built on mobility. Armies could move quickly, covering vast distances with a speed that surprised many neighboring regions. This mobility became one of their greatest advantages. As Mongol forces expanded outward, they encountered cities and kingdoms that were structured very differently from the steppe world. These were places with walls, fixed borders, and centralized administrations. They relied on fortifications and traditional siege defenses. At first, many of these regions underestimated the Mongols. They were seen as fragmented tribes from the north, not a unified military force. But this perception quickly changed. Mongol strategy was highly adaptive. They studied enemy structures, identified weaknesses, and used coordinated movement to disrupt established defenses. Rather than relying on static warfare, they applied constant pressure through speed and unpredictability. As campaigns progressed, entire regions began to feel the impact of this new form of expansion. Trade routes were affected, political structures were destabilized, and communication between distant regions became more difficult. However, within the Mongol system itself, organization remained strict. Genghis Khan ensured that discipline and loyalty continued to define his forces. Communication across long distances was maintained through structured relay systems. Orders could travel faster than many armies could move. This efficiency allowed the Mongol influence to extend further than many had previously imagined possible. Yet despite this expansion, the core identity of the Mongols remained connected to their origins. They were still shaped by the steppe, by movement, survival, and adaptability. Even as their reach grew, they did not fully abandon their nomadic foundation. Instead, they transformed it into a system capable of supporting large-scale expansion. Genghis Khan's leadership during this period was defined not only by conquest, but by structure. He was building something larger than a tribe, and more dynamic than a traditional kingdom. An interconnected system that could operate across vast distances. And as this system expanded, the world beyond the steppe began to change in response. As the Mongol influence expanded further, Genghis Khan began to reshape not only military structures, but also the way vast territories could be connected and governed. The expansion was no longer limited to nearby regions of the steppe. It now reached into distant lands where cities were larger, populations were denser, and political systems were more complex. Each new region introduced new challenges. Different languages, different customs, and different methods of governance all had to be understood and managed in some form. Rather than enforcing uniformity immediately, the Mongol system often adapted to local structures while maintaining overarching control. This flexibility allowed them to govern territories that were culturally and geographically diverse. At the same time, the movement of armies across these regions created new patterns of connection between previously isolated areas. Trade routes expanded. Information traveled further, and distant cities began to experience indirect contact through Mongol-controlled corridors. This period marked a transformation in how large-scale territories interacted. The world became more interconnected through movement and expansion. However, expansion also brought resistance. Some regions attempted to unify against Mongol advances. Others relied on fortified cities and traditional defensive strategies. Conflicts varied in scale and intensity, but the overall pattern remained consistent. Mongol forces continued to adapt and move faster than most opposing systems could respond. Within the Mongol leadership structure, coordination remained essential. Commands were distributed across wide distances through organized communication systems, allowing different groups to operate in sync even when separated by great space. This level of coordination was unusual for the time, and it contributed significantly to their continued expansion. Despite the scale of these developments, Genghis Khan's leadership remained focused on structure and control rather than personal display of power. His influence was reflected not in isolated victories, but in the system that supported continuous movement and adaptation. As time progressed, the Mongol presence extended across a vast portion of the known world. What began as fragmented tribes on the steppe had evolved into a connected network of territories, shaped by mobility and organization. And at the center of this transformation stood Genghis Khan, whose strategies were redefining how empires could function across distance. Yet, even as expansion continued, the foundations of the empire were being tested by its own scale, and history was still unfolding across every direction of the steppe. Story progress, 40%, Mongol segment. As the Mongol expansion continued, Genghis Khan began to face a different kind of challenge. One that came not from resistance alone, but from the sheer scale of what was being built. An empire that spreads quickly across vast distances begins to rely heavily on structure. Distance becomes a test of communication. Time becomes a test of coordination, and leadership becomes a test of delegation. To maintain control over such a large system, the Mongols developed increasingly organized methods of governance. Regional leaders were appointed to manage distant territories. Military units were structured into clear hierarchies, and communication routes were maintained with strict efficiency. Messages and orders could travel across long distances through relay stations, ensuring that the center of authority remained connected to its outer regions. This system allowed the empire to function as a single, coordinated structure, even when its parts were separated by thousands of kilometers. At the same time, local customs in conquered regions were often preserved to maintain stability. Rather than completely replacing existing systems, Mongol governance frequently adapted to them, as long as overall authority was acknowledged. This approach reduced resistance in many areas and allowed for smoother administration across diverse populations. However, the rapid expansion also introduced internal pressures. Different regions had different needs. Different environments required different strategies. and maintaining unity across such diversity required constant oversight. Genghis Khan remained at the center of this system, ensuring that the core principles of discipline, loyalty, and coordination were preserved. But as the empire grew, direct control over every region became increasingly difficult. This marked a shift from personal leadership to structured governance. The empire was no longer defined solely by the actions of one leader, but by the system that had been created under his direction. Meanwhile, the influence of the Mongol world continued to reshape trade, communication, and movement across vast areas. Regions that had once been isolated were now indirectly connected through shared routes and administrative structures. This created a new level of interaction across continents. And as the system expanded further, it began to move beyond the original scale that had been envisioned in the early days of the steppe. What had started as a unification of tribes had become something far larger, a continental structure of movement and control. But even as this system reached its height, time continued forward, and leadership, like all human structures, would eventually face transition. As the structure of the Mongol system expanded, the physical demands of governing such a vast territory began to shape its evolution. Genghis Khan now presided over an empire that stretched across regions with vastly different climates, cultures, and distances. From cold northern steppe regions to arid deserts and distant urban centers, the empire no longer existed as a single unified landscape. It had become a network of interconnected territories. In this environment, the importance of communication and trust within the leadership structure became even more critical. Local governors and military commanders were granted significant responsibility as long as they maintained loyalty to the central authority. This delegation allowed the empire to function without constant direct intervention from the center. At the same time, strict discipline remained a defining feature of Mongol governance. Order within the system was maintained through clear expectations, structured hierarchy, and consistent enforcement of rules. The ability to move information quickly across vast distances ensured that decisions made at the center could still influence distant regions effectively. Trade routes also became more stable under this system. Caravans traveled more safely across large areas, and economic activity increased in regions previously affected by conflict or fragmentation. This created a form of controlled connectivity across parts of Eurasia that had previously operated in isolation. However, as the empire grew more complex, its stability increasingly depended on the balance between central authority and regional autonomy. Maintaining this balance required continuous attention and coordination. Genghis Khan's leadership remained focused on ensuring that the foundational principles of the empire were preserved. even as its scale changed dramatically. These principles, movement, adaptability, and discipline, remained consistent across all levels of the system. Over time, the empire reached a point where its influence extended across vast portions of the known world. It was no longer just a regional power, but a structure that connected distant civilizations through control and communication. Yet even at this stage, the natural limitations of time, distance, and human leadership began to emerge more clearly. And as the system continued to expand, it also moved closer to a transition point that would define its next phase in history. As the Mongol Empire reached its greatest geographical extent, the nature of leadership began to shift subtly within the system shaped by Genghis Khan. The empire was no longer defined by expansion alone. It was now defined by maintenance, coordination, and long-term stability. At this scale, even small disruptions in communication or loyalty could have consequences across vast regions. To manage this, the Mongol system became increasingly structured. Authority was distributed among trusted commanders and administrators who were responsible for maintaining order in their respective regions. These individuals operated under the same foundational principles that had guided the early expansion: discipline, loyalty, and adaptability. Despite the distance between regions, the empire functioned through a shared system of communication and responsibility. This allowed distant territories to remain connected to a central framework of authority. Trade continued to move across major routes, linking cities and cultures that had once been separated by geography and political boundaries. In many regions, stability replaced previous cycles of conflict and fragmentation. However, the complexity of the empire also introduced new challenges. Different regions developed unique conditions based on their environment, population, and historical background. This required continuous adjustment in governance approaches. Uniform control was less practical than structured flexibility. Within this system, Genghis Khan's influence remained foundational. Even as responsibilities were delegated, the core principles he established continued to guide decision-making across the empire. But time inevitably introduced change. Leadership transitions became necessary as the scale of the empire exceeded what could be managed through direct personal oversight alone. The system he created, however, was designed in a way that allowed it to persist beyond individual leadership. Its strength lay not only in conquest, but in structure, and as generations would pass, the Mongol system would continue to evolve, carrying forward the mechanisms that had been established during its earliest formation. The empire, now vast and interconnected, stood as one of the largest continuous land-based structures in history. And yet, like all systems built by human hands, it existed within the limits of time. As time continued to pass, the vast structure shaped by Genghis Khan began to enter a new phase, one defined less by expansion and more by transformation. The empire, now stretched across immense distances, had become a complex network of regions, each operating under a shared framework but influenced by its own local conditions. This scale required constant coordination between distant administrative centers. Messages traveled across long routes, passing through relay systems that connected the heart of the empire to its outer edges. Despite the distance, the system maintained a level of cohesion that allowed it to function as a unified structure. Trade routes remained active, linking regions that had once been completely separate. Goods, ideas, and cultural influences moved along these paths, creating subtle connections across vast territories. In many ways, the empire had become not just a political structure, but also a channel of interaction between distant parts of the world. However, maintaining this level of unity required continuous effort. Regional differences naturally became more pronounced over time. Local leaders adapted governance to their environments while still operating under the broader authority of the Mongol system. This balance between unity and diversity became one of the defining characteristics of the empire's later stage. Genghis Khan's foundational influence remained embedded in the structure itself. Even as leadership responsibilities were distributed, the principles he had established continued to guide the functioning of the system. But no structure remains unchanged forever. As generations passed, leadership transitions introduced new dynamics into the empire's organization. Each transition brought adjustments in priorities, governance styles, and regional influence. The system evolved, adapting to the realities of scale and time. And while the empire remained vast and influential, it was no longer in its initial phase of expansion. It had entered a more complex stage of existence, one where preservation and adaptation became as important as growth once was. Still, the foundations built in the early years continued to shape its identity, and the legacy of its origin remained deeply embedded in its structure long after the early days of unification on the steppe had passed. As the Mongol system continued to evolve beyond its early expansion, the structure shaped by Genghis Khan began to experience the natural effects of time, distance, and generational change. What had once been a rapidly unified force was now a vast, multi-layered political and administrative network. Each region within the empire developed its own rhythms of life, influenced by geography, culture, and local governance. While the central principles of order and loyalty still remained, their expression varied across different territories. This diversity required a flexible approach to governance. Local authorities managed day-to-day affairs, while still acknowledging the overarching structure that connected them to the wider system. In this way, the empire functioned less like a single unified body and more like an interconnected framework of regions bound together by shared foundations. Trade routes continued to play a crucial role in maintaining this connection. Caravans and travelers moved across vast distances, linking cities that would otherwise have remained isolated from one another. These routes carried not only goods, but also knowledge, practices, and cultural influences. Over time, this exchange contributed to a gradual transformation in many regions under Mongol influence. Despite this interconnectedness, the challenges of maintaining unity across such a large system became increasingly evident. Distance naturally limited direct oversight. Regional differences became more pronounced, and local conditions began to shape governance more independently. The system adapted to these realities by relying on established structures rather than constant central intervention. Genghis Khan's original framework had been designed with adaptability in mind. This allowed the empire to persist even as its internal dynamics changed over time. However, leadership transitions inevitably brought new interpretations of authority and organization. Each new generation of leadership adjusted priorities based on the conditions of their time. As a result, the empire entered a long phase of transformation, one where preservation of structure became as important as expansion had once been. Yet despite these changes, the foundational legacy of its origin remained present. The system created in the early days of unification on the steppe continued to influence how the empire functioned across vast regions. And even as time moved forward, the imprint of its beginning remained embedded within its structure. As the final phase of the Mongol narrative unfolds, the system shaped by Genghis Khan stands as one of the most far-reaching structures of its time. What began as a unification of scattered tribes on the steppe has, over generations, transformed into a vast and layered network of regions connected through administration, trade, and shared historical foundations. In this late stage, the empire is no longer defined by rapid expansion or immediate conquest. Instead, it exists in a state of sustained complexity. Governance now relies heavily on established institutions and regional leadership structures. Local authorities manage the daily realities of their territories while still operating within the broader framework that connects them to the larger system. The long-established routes of communication and trade remain essential. Across deserts, plains, and mountain corridors, movement continues, linking distant regions that would otherwise be separated by geography and time. These connections maintain a sense of cohesion, even across vast distances. However, the passage of time inevitably introduces change. Different regions develop unique identities shaped by environment, culture, and local governance. These differences do not necessarily break the system, but they gradually alter its internal balance. The empire becomes less uniform and more layered in its structure. Leadership transitions across generations bring further evolution. Each new phase introduces adjustments in how authority is interpreted and applied. As a result, the empire continues to function, but in a form that is increasingly shaped by adaptation rather than expansion. Through all of these changes, the foundational influence of its origin remains present. The principles established during its formation, structure, discipline, and adaptability, continue to guide its overall framework. Even as time progresses and conditions evolve, these core ideas remain embedded in the system. And in this way, the legacy of its origin persists far beyond its initial moment of creation. The story of Genghis Khan's rise has moved from survival to unification to expansion and finally to long-term transformation. And as history continues forward beyond this point, the world shaped by his influence carries on in forms that extend far past the boundaries of his lifetime. Before we begin, slowly, just allow yourself to relax. You're about to travel back in time, not as a history lesson, but as a quiet experience. A journey into the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, the cradle of early civilization, where rivers shaped cities and cities shaped history. Imagine yourself standing in this ancient world. The air is warm, the ground is dry and timeless, and everything feels distant, yet present. There is no rush here, no urgency, only the slow rhythm of history unfolding. As you begin to walk, you are not just observing the past, you are moving through it. The sound of distant rivers, the soft wind over stone paths, the quiet life of ancient cities, all begin to surround you. As you begin to walk, you are not just observing the past, you are moving through it. The sound of distant rivers, the soft wind over stone paths, the quiet life of ancient cities all begin to surround you. And with every step you take, your thoughts begin to slow, your breath becomes softer, your body becomes lighter. You are safe here. You are calm here. And now, as we move deeper into this ancient world, we begin our journey through Mesopotamia. And slowly, very gently, you may begin to drift.
Not away from the story, but into it. Let the ancient world guide you. And as we continue, you may find yourself slowly falling asleep while walking through history.
The night is calm, not completely silent, but soft. The kind of quiet that feels alive, as if the world itself is slowly breathing. You are walking slowly, without effort. The ground beneath your feet is warm stone, still holding the memory of the sun. Each step is steady and quiet, blending into the rhythm of the night. Above you, the sky stretches wide and endless, filled with distant stars. In the distance, you begin to see a city, ancient, vast, and resting peacefully in the night. Babylon. It doesn't call to you, yet you move toward it. The road feels calm, and time itself seems to slow with every step. A gentle breeze passes by, warm and soft, carrying the scent of earth and water. You take a slow breath and begin to relax even more. The night continues, and you are still walking. As you come closer, tall walls rise before you, softened by moonlight. Torches flicker gently, casting a warm and steady glow. You step inside, and the air changes, cooler, softer, more calm. Somewhere nearby, you hear water flowing, a quiet and steady sound that draws you forward. You follow it slowly through silent streets. Everything feels distant, peaceful, and unhurried. And then rising before you in soft layers, you see the hanging gardens. Water flows gently from one level to another. Leaves move softly in the night air. You take a step forward, then another. The world becomes even quieter as you enter. The garden breathes slowly, and the night continues. You move deeper into the gardens, and the world becomes even quieter. Not empty, but softer, as if every sound has been gently lowered. The air is cool here, comfortable. It touches your skin like a calm breath. Water is everywhere now. Not loud, not rushing, just flowing, steady, endless. You follow a narrow stone path between the terraces. Above you, layers of green rise into the night sky. Below you, water moves slowly through carved channels. Each drop of water falls gently from one level to another. Soft, rhythmic, like the garden itself is breathing in silence. You slow down without even noticing, your steps becoming lighter, quieter. The sound of water surrounds you now, not overwhelming, but complete, filling every space between the stones, between the leaves, between your thoughts. Somewhere nearby, a small stream flows under stone arches, hidden, protected, constant. You pause for a moment and simply listen. There is no need to move quickly here, no need to reach anywhere. The garden does not ask anything from you. It only exists and invites you to exist with it. Leaves shift softly above your head, a gentle movement, almost invisible, like the night is breathing through them. Water continues to flow, layer after layer, stone after stone, time after time. And you realize something simple. You're no longer just walking through the garden. You are part of its silence now. Everything slows even more, thoughts fading gently into the background, leaving only the sound of water and calm. The hanging gardens feel endless here, not because they are large, but because they are still. And in that stillness, you begin to relax even deeper. The night continues quietly around you, and you continue with it. You stay in the quiet of the gardens. Time here feels softer now, almost as if it no longer moves forward in a straight line, but flows gently like water. The sound of the streams never changes, always steady, always calm. You begin to walk again, but slower than before, as if even movement has become optional. Stone steps lead you slightly higher into the terraces, each step warm from the memory of the day. Above you, hanging vines sway almost invisibly in the night air, soft shadows moving across stone walls. You notice how the water is guided through small carved channels, each one carefully shaped, each one letting water pass without resistance. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is simply continuous. Somewhere deeper in the garden, Water falls from a higher level, a soft, distant sound like a whisper repeating itself through stone. You follow that sound without thinking, not because you must, but because it feels natural. The air becomes even cooler as you move upward, and more still. Every breath feels easier now, deeper, slower. You pass beneath an arch covered in plants, leaves gently brushing the stone above your head. For a moment you stop again, just standing there, listening. Nothing calls you forward. Nothing pulls you back. There is only this moment, this quiet space between water and night. And in that space, everything feels balanced, soft, complete. The garden breathes slowly around you, and you breathe with it. The night continues, and you continue gently within it. You move even deeper into the upper terraces. The higher you go, the quieter everything becomes. Not because sound disappears, but because it no longer feels separate from you. Water still flows beside you, but now it sounds distant, like a memory of movement rather than movement itself. The stone here is older, smoother, shaped by time and constant water. You place your hand gently against it as you walk. It feels cool, still, grounded. Above, the garden opens slightly, revealing more of the night sky. Stars scattered like quiet thoughts across darkness. The air is lighter here, almost weightless, as if the garden is slowly releasing you from everything unnecessary. A soft breeze moves through the leaves, barely noticeable, yet it changes nothing and everything at the same time. You pause again, longer this time. There is no direction now, no path that feels more important than another. Only stillness, only breath. Somewhere far below, water continues its endless cycle through stone channels. But here, at this height, it feels like a distant heartbeat. Steady, calm. You begin to realize the garden is not something you are moving through anymore. It is something you are resting inside. The distinction between you and the garden begins to soften, like the edges of a dream gently fading. Everything becomes simpler, quieter, lighter. And in that simplicity, there is rest. The night holds you gently, and you no longer feel the need to go anywhere else. You remain in that quiet place. The upper terraces of the garden are now still around you, not empty, but complete in their silence. Even the sound of water feels distant here, like it belongs to another layer of the world. You stand between stone and sky, between movement and stillness. And for a moment, nothing changes. The night feels suspended, as if time itself has slowed down enough to be barely noticeable. A soft wind passes through the garden, touching leaves, then disappearing, without direction, without urgency. You breathe in slowly and hold nothing in return. The air feels clean, light, calming in a way that asks nothing from you. Below, the city of Babylon rests quietly. Its distant presence no longer feels separate, just part of the same calm world you are in. You take a small step forward, then stop again, not because you have arrived somewhere, but because there is nowhere else to reach. The hanging gardens are no longer something you observe. They are something you are surrounded by, something you exist within. Stone, water, leaves, night, all blending into a single quiet rhythm. Even your thoughts begin to slow, fading gently into the background, one by one, until there is almost nothing left to think, only feeling, only stillness. The garden does not change, and it does not need to, because it is already enough, exactly as it is. And you are enough here too, without movement, without effort, just present, just resting, just part of the quiet night. You stay there a little longer without needing to move. The hanging gardens are completely still around you now, not silent in absence, but silent in fullness. Every sound that remains feels distant and softened. Water, wind, leaves, all blending into one gentle presence. You notice how even your awareness feels lighter, less focused, less sharp, as if the garden is slowly carrying your thoughts away from you, one by one. There is no need to hold on to anything anymore, no need to follow anything. Just this moment, this quiet space, this still night. The stone beneath you feels steady and warm from the day that has passed. The air above you feels endless and calm. And between them, you simply exist. Far below, Babylon continues its quiet life, but it no longer feels distant, only connected, like part of the same breath. You take another slow breath and release it without effort. Nothing changes, and yet everything feels softer. The garden does not guide you anymore. It simply holds you. And in that holding, there is comfort, there is calm, there is rest. You no longer feel the need to continue walking, because the journey... And now, even that sense of movement begins to fade. Not suddenly, but gently, like a final layer of awareness slowly dissolving into the night. The hanging gardens remain around you, but they no longer feel like a place you are in. They feel like a feeling, soft, endless, calm. The sound of water continues somewhere far away, but it no longer pulls your attention. It simply exists, like a distant memory of peace. You are no longer searching, no longer observing. There is only stillness now. The air feels heavier in a comforting way, as if it is gently holding you in place, not restricting, just supporting. Your thoughts slow even further, each one fading before it can fully form, until there is almost nothing left to follow. Only awareness, soft and quiet. The garden, the city, the world beyond it, all begin to feel distant, not gone, just far away. And what remains is this moment, this calm. And as you drift even deeper into stillness, the boundaries between sound and silence begin to fade completely. The hanging gardens are no longer something you can clearly sense, not because they are gone, but because they are no longer separate from you. Everything becomes softer, quieter, slower. Even the idea of movement feels distant now, like something that belongs to another time. There is only calm, only presence, only the gentle rhythm of stillness that holds everything together. You do not need to understand anything anymore. You do not need to follow anything. All that remains is this quiet sense of being, light, soft, endless. The sound of water, the breath of wind, the memory of stone and garden, all of it fades into a single quiet feeling, peace. And as you drift even deeper into stillness, the boundaries between sound and silence begin to fade completely. The hanging gardens are no longer something you can clearly sense, not because they are gone, but because they are no longer separate from you. Everything becomes softer, quieter, slower. Even the idea of movement feels distant now, like something that belongs to another time. There is only calm, only presence, only the gentle rhythm of stillness that holds everything together. You do not need to understand anything anymore. You do not need to follow anything. All that remains is this quiet sense of being, light, soft, endless. The sound of water, the breath of wind, the memory of stone and garden, all of it fades into a single quiet feeling, peace. And now there is nothing left to follow. No path, no sound, no direction. Only a deep and quiet stillness that surrounds everything equally. The hanging gardens are no longer a place in your mind, not even a memory. Just a soft presence, blending into the calm of the night. Even time feels distant now, as if it has slowed down enough to disappear completely. There is no movement forward and no return, only the feeling of being held gently by something vast and peaceful. You are not thinking anymore, not searching, not observing, just resting. The air feels weightless. The silence feels complete. And in that completeness, everything softens even more. Thoughts dissolve before they form. Feelings dissolve before they rise, until only calm remains. A calm that does not change, a calm that does not move, a calm that simply is. You are not separate from it anymore. You are part of it. And as the night continues without end, you continue with it, gently, quietly, and completely at rest. And now even the thought of continuing begins to fade, not as something lost, but as something that is no longer needed. Everything has already softened into stillness. There is no direction left to follow, no distance left to cross. Only this quiet, endless calm. It does not grow. It does not shrink. It simply remains, like the gentle space between thoughts, like the pause between breaths. You are no longer holding on to anything, not even awareness itself. Just resting deeply, quietly, without effort. The world feels far away now, not gone, just unimportant in this moment of peace. And yet, nothing is missing. Everything feels complete. The stillness does not ask anything from you. It does not guide you. It does not shape you. It simply holds you gently, without resistance. And in that holding, you begin to let go even more. Not into sleep, not into wakefulness, but into something softer than both. A place where nothing needs to continue, and nothing needs to end. Only calm remains. And you remain with it, fully at ease, fully still, and completely at rest. And now, there is nothing more to continue. No story left to follow, no place left to reach. Only this final stillness, soft, complete, and endless. The garden, the city, the night, all of it gently fades away, not disappearing suddenly, but slowly, like a distant dream losing its shape. What remains is calm, pure, quiet calm. You do not need to think anymore. You do not need to follow anything. There is only rest, deeper than thought, softer than silence. And as this moment settles completely, even the feeling of time begins to dissolve. There is no before, no after, only now, stretching endlessly, without effort, without change. You are safe here, completely at ease. Nothing is required of you anymore. And so you simply rest, gently, quietly, fully at peace. And the night continues, without end, as you drift deeper into calm. And now even that final sense of continuation begins to soften. There is nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to follow. Only a deep and quiet presence that fills everything equally. The idea of distance fades. The idea of movement fades. Even the feeling of you becomes lighter, softer, almost weightless. Everything is still here, and yet nothing needs to be noticed anymore. The world does not end. It simply becomes quiet. Like a long breath slowly settling into silence. There is no effort in this place, no direction, no urgency, only calm. A calm that does not ask for attention, a calm that does not change. You are not moving toward anything now. You are simply resting within what already is. Soft, still, endless. And as this quiet continues, even that awareness begins to gently fade into peace, until there is nothing left to do and nothing left to become. Only rest, only stillness, and you remain there, completely calm, completely quiet, and gently at sleep.